Hi, today I want to address the elephant in the room, AI coding, AI development. And we've seen a lot of platforms come out. Cursor is the one that gets the biggest hype. We got Replit and all of those platforms that are the next big thing. We also got Claude and ChatGPT. And people are, they are like replacing their brain with an AI to then just say, I need this, and just copy, paste. And I did it, or I'm doing it too, so I may expose myself here today. But, it's great to cut corners. It's great to cut corners, and it's great to get something quick out there. And if you know what you're doing, you would be a fool if you don't use AI, because you could work so much more faster. You're so much more efficient. You don't have syntax error where you miss a comma. Happened to me too many times. But the downside, and this is what I'm talking about here in this video, is if you don't know code and you're trying to hack your way around using AI, I think there are better options, there are better alternatives. And quite frankly, if you don't know what a variable is and you don't know basic JavaScript, you will not go far using AI tools. Now, we've seen people like a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old building a full AI application inside of an AI tool, using natural language. And everybody says, yeah, the NVIDIA CEO said it, natural language, that's the future. It is the future. But if we look at the reality right now, it is still very limited. And a lot of people, I think, have false ideas of what AI can do. You can't go to Claude, and let's share my screen. Let's do this together. I can't go to Claude and say, I can go far, but I can say, make an email builder with a backend like Resend, just like that, right? Because and backend like Resend, and it would just start generating the code. It would start generating some React, and I may be even able to run it in there. But most of the setup, right? I would have my to subject body. It's also not an email builder. I'm talking about something that is like drag and drop and all of that. So it gets the prompts not always right? And then with this one, what happens when I send the email? Let's do it to me. Hey at nocodeprocode.com. Let's add a random subject, random body. It's not sending it anywhere, right? I need to set up things on the back end. I need to run this in the command line. Now, we need to go with a little bit more advanced technical setup. Now, tools like Cursor, which I also have, right? It's actually a pretty handy tool. They can run that stuff for you using AI, which is very interesting. But you are adding dependencies, you're adding packages in there. If you don't know code, how do you maintain it? That's my main thing. Like, you can use, there are also a lot of no-code tools like Bubble that are quite frankly hard to maintain. I personally find WeWeb hard to maintain too, just because it's very blocky, and Whist is also one example that's hard to maintain. There are plenty of no-code tools out there that are hard to maintain, right? If you don't do the proper setup, Toddle can be hard to maintain. But my point is here, if you are wanting to build a full stack application from scratch using AI without technical understanding, it may be hard, and I would not recommend it, because maintenance will be a pain. And if you don't have the understanding, you won't understand if AI made mistakes. Now, what I like to do is I like to combine AI with low-code tools, with no-code tools, and they're actually pretty handy no-code tools. One example is Toddle, which is actually a pretty powerful no-code tool, because it lets you write code, and you can do, this is by the way all built in Toddle, but it is basically React, but not using React dependencies. But it's very close to React, it's very React-y. And let's say if you can build in React, you can build it in Toddle. It's like a low-code React version. It has server-side rendering, so it's more like Next.js and no-code, and you can connect to backends. And the setups are very simple. And let's actually create an app together, and let's use AI to help us set up something inside of this no-code tool. It gets simpler if we combine no-code, low-code together with AI. So let's just go to my workspace here and let's do test AI video. Just like that. We create a project. And how about we build, I don't know, an AG grid, right? I don't know the documentation for AG grid out of the top of my head. So I'm going to go to Claude and say, make an AG grid with fake sample data in vanilla JS. So it works in Toddle. You want to add vanilla JS. That helps pretty far, right? And then how you get the data, how you illustrate the data, that is something that you can do through Toddle, which is super handy. So we got the AG grid in here, right? I can copy the code for the AG grid. We'll see, we got the AG grid in here. And I want to separate the HTML from the JavaScript. So let's say, give me the HTML and JS separated. Because the way most of those low-code tools work is they illustrate, they separate the HTML, and they separate the JavaScript. Here we go. And can we say, is there a fake API like the Star Wars API, for example, that we could call and base the rows on? And let's see if we can call the Star Wars API, for example, Swappy, and get some fake data. And now I'm going to show you also how those no-code tools can make the job a little bit easier, a little bit better to understand. So we got the HTML, and we want to say, I want to be able to call the Swappy API in my no-code tool, but use the JS to then update the AG grid with, it should say with the new JSON data. But, we can use AI to help us around those things inside those tools, which I think is actually pretty cool. So we got the setup, and we're going to add, some of the dependencies in here, and we would have our grid in here, and then we would see const swappy data, and we would then push it in here. So this is the setup, and what I want to do is I want to say I need to load the configuration at the JS file using fetch. Most of the times if you build this as web components, you want to do fetch in them. Just the way that the component is a separate environment attached on the shadow DOM. But AI can also help you out figure how to do that, which it helps us too, right? But it looks like garbage that it did here. And this is, again, if you don't know what to look for, yeah, this is wrong. It says, I want this fetched, please. That should be the one being fetched. And then after it's fetched, and I did not mean to share that. And after it's being fetched, it should be able to successfully load everything. Here we go. We got that all set up. Beautiful. AG grid library. And no, it actually gave us complete garbage. You add this as a script tag, but I don't want a script tag. I want this to be fetched via fetch API, as the tool I use requires this. It doesn't require it, but I like to do it that way. So sometimes it helps to give AI a little bit more boundaries. So here we go. Let's look at our code. We'll load that and create a script tag. And then ensure AG grid is available. And ideally, We got that in an isolated environment here. We got the height. We got all that. That looks good. So I want to say simplify the code as much as possible. So I have the HTML, the initialization, and the loading of data, just like that. And now we see we got the HTML, we got the initialization with the basic configuration, right? And then we got the initial data, and then we got also the update data function. So now we can take this code that ChatGPT generated or Claude generated. I would just copy the div and we can move it over into the tool that gives us an environment that we can understand. So how about we remove the content in here, we'll paste it in here, and we'll make sure the div is 100% and also has like a height maybe of 25 rem, so we can give it a fixed height. I can go to the background and it's nice and visual. You don't need to, imagine how it will look until you do those things. We use the benefits of AI, but we put it in an environment where we can actually easier work with it. That is the big benefit of NoCode. NoCode has been, has its issues, but combined with AI, I think we have great resources to do things properly. So we can copy this to initialize it, and I can take this div, and I should actually make this height 100%, right? And then we would double click on here and extract this as a component so it becomes reusable for us inside of the Toddle framework. And I call this editor, no, AG grid. This is not Chart.js, it's AG grid. AG grid. Here we go. Did I call it Chart.js or AG grid? For some reason, no, this is AG grid. Yeah, AG grid. Yeah, for some reason I was thinking about Chart.js. But here we go. And we go to actions and we call it load grid, right? We create a custom JavaScript file here. And inside of those brackets is how most of those no-code tools work. They define a certain context. They define some certain abstractions they add in there. And first, my tip is let's get it first working with dummy data, hard-coded, right? We got the migrate, and then we'll make it dynamic. So let's go inside of this element, this div block here, and we would add, we already got the class in there with the ID and the theme. Beautiful. So on load, we would want to load the grid, and let's try actually reloading the page and reloading the web component it houses. And let's see, yeah, we can see we are loading the grid in here with some sample data. Now, the initialization should be empty, so we want to go in here and just make it an empty array. Here we go. Now we get this to be an empty array, and we can also make the ID dynamic so that if we want to have multiple IG grids on the page, so for now I can make this ID dynamic, so I just would remove this. I would add a backtick. But coming back to my point, if you don't have a basic understanding of programming, those things are going to be a little bit harder. And I got that in here, so I can add a dynamic value. So I can pass in an argument called ID that will be a string, and I can go args.id to then target the ID. I go to AG grid. Now we won't see the grid because we don't have an ID. So I can go on attributes here, and I can add an ID so we can dynamically pass an ID from the front end. So we have an ID for each grid if we want to, for example, add context to update it outside of its window. And the ID could for this one be my grid, for example. And on load, we can go and, actually we would base it dynamically on the ID that we load. So now, as we can see, if we load, we would be able to load the grid, and we will be able to pass on. It dynamic ID, actually, I need to also go on the div in here and match its attribute to be dynamic. And we can also make its class for the theme using an attribute dynamic as well. So I would do theme and I would paste it in here. So, and then I would go in here and I would base it on the theme attribute. So we got those things dynamic so we can reuse it. So those things really are exciting. No rows to show, right? Now, if we would do an API call, we could run code to make the API call. We can also make it visually in Toddle here, helping us make the setup easier. So let's go to Swappy API. That is like the Star Wars API. And I have no idea which one we called. So let's look at Claude again. And let's look at the Swappy API it gave us earlier to get some inspiration how it called it. That was in the JavaScript function. Here we go, character, height. We got those things. So how about we scroll a little bit up. Star Wars API, yeah, that looks good. So we got that in here instead of running this code to make the fetch call in here, right? Which is not that much actually. We could just go inside of the API in Toddle, put it in here. Of course, they are adding their own abstraction to this, but I think it makes it really simpler to do those things. So we could have our API call in here, right? And then we can even make the API call outside to make it even more precise and dynamic. But you know, you get the idea. So we can call this API, for example, and we then have now a visual way to illustrate the API. So we have with NoCode, the value you get is the environment. You have an environment where you can link those dots together easier. Combined with AI, you have superpowers. So what we're doing now is we want to get the data in the AG grid. So we got this function here that we defined to update the data, and that should do the thing. We may need to attach it though on the window if it doesn't work, but let's see if it works or not. So let's call this update data. We will create this, and let's first test it with the hard-coded data that it gave us, just so that we can see if it works. So I can go to update data, right? And let's just actually add a button. So we got a button in here, and I go to event on the button, on click. I want to update the data. So we want to see if I click in here, I'm loading the data. So that works successfully. So now we want to remove the button that kind of like helped us figure things out. And we want to go on the API call, right? And after, so on success of this auto fetch API call, which is server side rendered, I want to, not load grid, I want to update the data. Here we go. So now when I reload the page and it does the API call, we would see that after success of the API call, which of course now happens client side because it updates the data, but you could even make it more robust, setting its initial state if you want, to then have like the server side approach. But you know, we're getting over ourselves a little bit here. This is like a simple solution. We would have that set in here. So we now want to make the data dynamic based on the output that came from the API. So I can go to my update data part here, and I would go and have data equal our argument of data. That would be a list, as it would be an array. And I do args dot data. So I can have my dynamic input, and I call my function to update it. Now we see there is no input. But when I go on my API, on my success state in here, you'll see I got my data part in here. So I can go to FX, and I can go to API, data, and I would go to results, and I would get the list of the characters. So now if I would reload the web component in here, right, you would see that we would then populate this based on the Star Wars API that comes dynamically from the API in our grid. And AI helped us set this up. And we got our environment where things are simple to understand. Now, we got multiple options too. we could move the API for Swappy right outside of this component and make a different approach. So we could do unload. We would load my grid. And what we can do is, after the grid was successfully loaded, we'll be also able to set like initial data to the grid. So we could also add the data attribute to the grid to have an initial data set up. So there are a few things how we can do those things. So we can make this a list. And in here, I can pass on args.data so that I have, when I initialize my grid, on load, I can take the data. So I can go to attributes, data, and I would then add some sample data for Swappy. So in here, we could actually copy, and we want the people API. Yeah, we got that one, but it gives us one. So we just want to call people to get all. Here we go. So we got results. This gives us our people. Oh, and oh, I'm moving things. This gives us our people. So let's copy this array. Here we go. And we go to JSON prettify. And we're going to prettify the JSON process. Now we got our prettified version. We're going to copy this to clipboard. Now we can add some sample data. That's pretty extensive sample data, actually. It's pretty extensive sample data. But that should do it. So we got our sample data in here. And then we would also pass on the format that we want to initialize in here. So we could also add the format. So I need to go and make that dynamic. So when I do my load grid function, I got my column data in here, right? Where I got my column defs. I got those as an array. And you could make things as dynamic as you want. So let's just remove this. And let's add format as a list. And in here, oh, where did I remove it? Over there, I can do args.format to add this value in dynamically. And then I can go to load grid. Now we see it's not loaded. And now I would go to my format and set its sample value in here. And that should be JSON. So let's go to JSON prettify. And we just remove all the stuff we got in here and we make this JSON. Now we got this JSON. And now we can copy this. And we can now go back to Toddle. And we would go to our format. And we would remove the thing that we have in here. Here we go. And we're going to paste it in here. And now we got our structure for the AG grid. And now I would actually make this a workflow. So we can create a workflow in our visual tool. And we call this render grid, right? And I would go in here, and in the render grid function, I would go and load grid, right? And in here, I would take the ID input of my grid, and data would then, with data, we would be able to, what are we doing here? Data, yeah, we would pass on the data. Those are the people. And then we would pass on the format of the data. We should have that set up. So now we want to do this workflow, unload. NoCode is just a nicer organization of code files. That's basically all it is. And we got our data in here, and this is also what enables us to do the server-side rendering. And we got that. And then on attribute change, for example, if we want to change some of the data, we would probably just re-render the grid, and we would not even need the update function. But we could also still create a workflow called update grid data. So if we only want to update the data in here, so let's call this upgrade inline grid data, just so we're more precise. And we could add an input in here called data. And we could then also add a test value, but we don't need to do that. And we want to expose it in contexts so we can actually do this outside of the component, for example. And in here, and we would also add another one called grid ID, so we can target the proper grid to run this. And we would do on plus, and we would go update grid, update data, and the data would be the data part. But of course, our data function does not actually do that. So actually, that's a pretty bad idea doing it that way. Let's just re-render the grid. That's the simplest version. On attribute change, we re-render it because its dependencies are changing. So we just reinitialize the whole thing. I think that should be a good solution. So we can actually remove the update data part. That's not needed for this example, but you know, you can customize things to your liking. That's the nice thing if those tools give you flexibility for the code. So what we end up having in here right now is I can add plus, and I can add an AG grid, and I got my AG grid in here, and I can add my data. So actually, how about I go back and just open Toddle in a new window, and it's early in the morning here. Bear with me. Let's open the app here. And we can go to our test AI video. And we can go on edit, and we just copy it over from the component because I don't want to go back to AI and just figure out what we did. And we see we got our sample data. So we just copy the sample data. And we go in here in our dynamic configuration, and we paste in our data. Probably we want to go on FX and paste it in here, as Toddle has like their super cool way of illustrating arrays, a little bit complicated than it should be, but we should be able to also paste it in here. Here we go. We should also be able to paste our format. So we go to format and copy the format. We should be able to paste the format, and then we should be able to add an ID, my grid, and we should be able to add a theme. The theme would be AG theme Alpine. Here we go. And oh, I don't want that in quotes. So we have our dynamic way of working with it. And now we would wrap this in an element that would be a div. So we give it our styling, our width, and I could do width 100% and height 25 rem. Now let's see if we reload if that works. Otherwise, we would have to turn it into variables to then render it properly. Yeah, so that doesn't initialize. So for the data part and for the format part, I want to create variables. So we can call this grid data, right? And we go have our variables, so we maintain the JSON structure. We go to data, we copy the data, and we paste it in here. Beautiful, and it already formatted it. We got our grid data as JSON, and then we got our grid format. And this can come from your database as well. It just needs to be set as JSON. I think we may have some stringification going on that's messing up with it if we copy it from here. As you can see here, yeah, we stringify it. That's the issue, and now it formats it properly. So we got the grid format, and now we could go in here and go to data and link it to the grid data variable, and we can go to the format and link it to the grid format variable, and now we got our AG grid in here. And as you can see, it works beautifully. We're able to scroll, we're able to filter based on things. Just like that, we're able to drag and drop the rows. And thanks to AI, we got this built. But we don't have it in a code editor that confuses us and makes it harder to maintain it for us. We have it where we can configure it using attributes simply like this. We got our visual formulas. We could even add filters that are very visually first. For example, we only want to show name includes I want to do, what did I do here? I want to do item, name, includes, and then I wanted to include, I don't know, let's add a string of L. And now we only have the ones that have an L in their name. And then we can only have the ones with a J, which is no one. We can do O, and we got everyone with an O. So we can do those things visually. We don't need to do this in like a whole environment inside of a code editor. We can do those things, and if we need to edit things in here, we just simply go in here, make sure we reload the page, because right now we are initializing it twice, so we may want to add more code to destroy the editor when we rerun this, which is probably a good idea. So this is where our friend AI comes back to our rescue. Let's just copy the whole thing and say this one works great, but at the start I wanna destroy all AG grids with the dynamic ID coming from the args.id. That's how we get the ID from .id, args.id, to avoid rendering multiple instances. And what NoCode or low-code really does, it just gives you a nicer text editor. You will be coding probably as much as you would do in other tools, but it gives you a nicer way to manage those things, and it really speeds up the process in implementing the code that the AI tools give you. So let's just remove this here, right? So we just remove the function, and we'll add it in here. So we destroyed. Actually, we need to paste the whole thing. So we have our function to actually, I think, destroy it. Where do we do that? Window instances, grand instance. Let's look at what AI told us. Update grid, new data, new grid, grid instance, update instance. Before new, we check if there is already an existing. Okay, they added some nice logic in here. So we'll see if it still works. And it still works. And let's see if we would get double rendering. If we would go back to the homepage like we had before and double click in here, that seemed to solve the issue. Now, if you want to update things, you can go in here and you can update those. You can click in here, right? And edit the code. You got a nicer environment to work with. That's what you're really paying with no-code and low-code. And that ultimately speeds up development for more visually focused people, as it reduces the hassle around maintenance and that you can't find your files. It's very handy. The biggest benefit in no-code is probably something that sounds like a very low selling point. It's organization. The way you organize your things. You're probably writing the same code visually or even not visually, as you can see in this custom action here. It's not that visual, right? But you're writing the same amount of code, or maybe a little bit less, but the way you manage the code is way simpler. And even without having that much of a deep understanding, you're not getting overwhelmed by all the files, by all the dependencies, how to load things. I think no-code gets the value in duct taping things together, or duct taping, that sounds like Zapier and MemberStack and Webflow and Whisk. And with Toddle, it's like it binds things together easier. So now we got that sample data in here, but actually, how about we get that data from an API call? Now, that would be a whole additional setup we would have to do. Inside of this no-code tool, I would go back to Swappy, and I would not hard code the data, right? In this case, I would get it dynamically from an API. So we would just call the people API. So that would be swappy dev/people. So we do swappy dev/people. As you can see, we would get the response. That's the API. So I can go in here on my page and create an API, and I can call that swappy. I have auto fetch on, so we got that rendering part. Here we go. Beautiful. And now, when we render this, I just simply actually want to remove the grid data variable because we won't need it. And I can go on my grid in here and I can update this to come from the API data results. So I got the data now dynamically loaded from the API in here. And as we can see, we got it all server-side rendered and served to us using the HE grid. Now, those changes, if changing it from the variable to just make an API call, we did this in under a minute. This maintainability also for people who are not that technical. So you have technical people set up the platform, build the stuff, and then non-technical people maintain it, do the updates, or people who just want to do quick in there and just make a change, marketing people just make a quick change to update this based on the new AP or whatever stuff they want to do. Marketing always has crazy ideas, like Vakas from Toddle. It puts them really in power. This is where I see the future. The future, I think, will be combining no-code, low-code with AI, because no-code has limitations. AI, if not used properly, with improper training, improper backend knowledge, with improper basic JavaScript fundamentals understanding, has issues, has flaws, a bunch of them. They both have flaws, but the things where AI code generation is weak is where no code is strong. And the things where no code is weak is where AI code generation is strong. So I think in future, our job is combining the proper no-code tool that puts us in a position where we can actually do those custom stuff with the proper AI code generation that lets us artificially generate the code to use it. And then in the middle, we'll put some brain power in the middle, keep the humans alive. And then combining those together will create new opportunities, will create a better development experience. And this, at the end, makes dev work more accessible for most people, for everyone, and it puts people who are domain experts in a position where they can actually build their ideas and realize their ideas. So the CEO of NVIDIA was true when he says no code is the future. I hope I don't misquote him. This is just what I heard from other people, and that human language is the future. We do it. But I think human language is more than just telling a computer on what kind of code to output. It's also having frameworks like Toddle, where I can just simply go in here and make a filter. I can just go in here, I do filter, I go and take the name, I want to equals or includes, and I wanted to include a string of L or of O, and now I only got all characters with O. This is human language. I think this combined with AI coding is the future of development. Now, the next future would be having a button in here, changing this now to JavaScript, so that then developers can go in here and update things, and having another button to change it back to the Node style. I think this is where we have it later down the road, because the combination between moving from code to visual and from visual to code is a hard exercise, but if done properly, will make development even more accessible to people. Maybe some ideas for the Toddle team. But those are my insights on how low-code, no-code, in combination with AI, can shift the way we develop. We got some examples. We used AI here. So I hope that you got some great insights. Let me know if you think if AI is coming for our jobs, or if AI is creating more jobs, or what your position is on AI-assisted coding. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate that, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.